guys, so welcome back. So today's video is going to be another makeup and mystery installment, as you guys seem to really like these. The next few ones that I do are going to be ones that aren't as well known, and then some very famous ones as well. I wanted to do some famous ones because sometimes I feel like we know about them but we don't know the full extent of them, if that makes sense to you. Sorry if there's any background noise. My walls are thin in this house, like they're just thin. I can hear dogs barking now. So if you do hear any noise, I apologise. I will try to put some background music in if I can to kind of block it out. Okay, so today's person is Ted Bundy, and I'm sure pretty much everyone's heard of him. If not, you know about what happened. But I also feel like there was parts where I was reading, I was like, what? I didn't know that bit. So yeah, we're going to talk about him today. So I also want to put out a disclaimer: if murder, people of a younger age, if, you know, details of how someone died, or assault or sexual assault is going to trigger you, I would say not to watch this video. Also, if you're a young child, well, a young person, don't watch it. Maybe go on one of my other videos. But yeah, just wanted to put that out there. Okay, so Ted Bundy was actually born Theodore Robert Cowell on the 24th of November 1946. So when he was born, his mother was actually unmarried, and at the time that was, you know, a big no-no. And his father, we don't actually know who his biological father is. So some say it's an air veteran, Lloyd Marshall, while others say it's Jack Worthington, and some people even said it was his own grandfather. However, in 1951, his mother Louise married Johnny Bundy, and apparently Ted had little to no respect for Johnny, as he was too working class and uneducated for him. Now, Louise and Johnny went on to have several other children together in the time that they was together. So Ted was born in Burlington, Vermont. Couldn't say that word there just then. So as he was an illegitimate child, he and all his friends and other family members were told that Ted's mother was actually his older sister, and he was adopted by his grandparents. A few years after this is when Louise moved to Washington, and that is where she met Johnny. So from all appearances, Ted grew up content in a working class family, and he actually showed an unusual, very unusual interest in death at a very early age. So at the age of 3, Ted became very fascinated in knives, and his Aunt Julia actually remembers waking up from a nap one day and she was surrounded by kitchen knives around her bed, and Ted was just at the end of it smiling. Ted was a very shy but very bright child. He seemed to do very well in school, but not so well with peers. And then later on, he actually told biographers that he chose to be alone as he couldn't understand interpersonal relationships and had no sense of how to develop them. However, classmates from his high school said that Ted was actually well known and very well liked. The only real sport that Ted kind of enthusiastically took was downhill skiing, and he did that with like items that he stole and forged lift tickets. So it's a good start, that. Good start to his life. So really, by the time he was a teenager, he was already stealing and forging tickets and had a very unusual interest in death and knives. So by the time Ted was a teenager, he liked to peer like in strangers' windows, and also he thought nothing of stealing. He also was arrested at least 2 times on the suspicion of burglary and auto theft. So Ted attended University of Washington. He fell in love with a woman from California, and when she broke off, he was devastated. Now, many of his victims actually resembled her, so they were all attractive and had long dark hair. So by the mid-70s, Ted had actually become more like active and socially outward and like confident, and he's very active in social and political matters. Now, when he dropped out of high school, he worked as like a number of minimum wage jobs, and he also volunteered at the Seattle office of Nelson Rockefeller's presidential campaign. He also became Arthur Fletcher's driver and bodyguard during Fletcher's campaign for Lieutenant Governor of Washington State. He even got a letter of recommendation from the Republican governor of Washington after he worked on his campaign. So after Ted dropped out of college, he did quite well for himself in that aspect. He seemed to be very well liked by this point, and it seemed like he was really kind of changing his life a little bit. Well, that's what everyone thought on the outside anyway. So in 1976, Ted met a woman named Elizabeth Colliver or something. I can't pronounce her name. I'm very sorry. I'm very, very, very sorry. She was a divorcee who worked at the University of Washington School of Medicine. In mid-1970, Ted was now focused and goal-orientated and enrolled at the university again, but this time as a psychology major. So Ted actually became an honour roll student and was well regarded by his professors, and in 1971 he was working at Seattle's suicide hotline crisis centre. So after he graduated university in 1972, he joined Governor Daniel J. Evans' re-election campaign. So after Evans was re-elected, Ted was actually hired as Davis's assistant. So he was the assistant to like Ross Davis, the chairman of Washington State Republican Party. God, it's a mouthful sometimes. So Davis actually thought very well of Ted, and in 1973 Ted was accepted into the law school of UPS and University of Utah solely on the strength of Davis's recommendation, Evans' recommendation, and several of his university professors. So during his trip to California in 1973, Ted rekindled his romance with his ex from university that broke up with him in the first place, which he was devastated by. She was impressed by how serious Ted had become, and dedicated and professional. Now, he dated her and Elizabeth both at the same time. Neither of them knew about the other one because, basically he was just a guy. So Brooks flew out to Seattle several times to stay with Ted. They even discussed marriage, and he even introduced her to Davis as his fiancée. So in January 1974, Ted abruptly ended all contact with Brooks. She could not get hold of him at all until about a month later. So now when she did get hold of him, she demanded to know what had happened. And he said in a very flat, calm voice, "Stephanie, I have no idea what you mean." And then he hung up, and she never heard from him again. Which, if someone had done that to me, I would have been pretty annoyed, like, you know. So he later on told biographers that he just wanted to prove to himself that he could have married her. And that's the only reason that they got back together in the first place. When Ted was arrested, he admitted to killing 36 people, but experts believe it probably was about 100 or more. But shortly after midnight on January the 4th, 1974, Ted entered the basement apartment of Karen Sparks, who was 18 at the time. She was a dancer and a student of University of Washington. So after Ted had beaten Karen senseless with a metal rod that was from her bed frame, he then sexually assaulted her, but it wasn't made clear if it was with the same metal rod or with like a metal speculum. A lot of things said like different ideas on that one, so I couldn't get it to be precise, so sorry about that. However, whatever it was caused intensive internal injuries, and Karen remained unconscious for 10 days afterwards. However, she did survive, but with permanent physical and mental disability. So in the early hours of February the 1st, Ted broke into Anne Healy's basement room. She was a University of Washington undergraduate who broadcasted morning radio, weather, sports for skiers. So Ted beat Linda unconscious, dressed her in blue jeans, a white blouse and some boots, and carried her away. So the first half of 1974, female college students were disappearing at the rate of about one per month. And on March 12th, Donna Manson, who was an 18-year-old student at the Evergreen State College of Olympia, so she left her dorm to attend a jazz concert, but she never arrived. So on April the 17th, Susan Rancourt disappeared, and she was going back to her dorm from an advisors meeting at the Central Washington State College. So two female students later came forward to discuss encounters that they had. One was on the same night of Susan's disappearance, and one was 3 nights prior to this. So it was with a man in an arm sling carrying a lot of books, asking for help to carry them to his brown/tan Volkswagen Beetle. So on May the 6th, Roberta Parks left her dorm at Oregon State University as she was going to have coffee with a friend. However, she never arrived. However, as this was happening, detectives from King County and Seattle Police Departments grew increasingly concerned about what was going on. Now, they had no significant physical evidence, and the missing women had little in common apart from being young, attractive white college students with long hair parted down the middle. So now we skip to the 1st of June, and 20-year-old Brenda Bull disappeared after leaving the Flame Tavern, which was in Burien, and she was last seen in the parking lot talking to a brown-haired man in an arm sling. Now the arm sling kind of becomes his MO at first, you know, what he uses to draw people in. Now, on the 11th of June, in the early hours, a University of Washington student disappeared walking down a light alley. Their name was Gregorian Hawkins. So she disappeared between her boyfriend's dorm and her sorority house. Now, the next morning, 3 homicide detectives and a criminalist combed the whole, entire area on their hands and knees, and they found nothing. Now, once the disappearance was actually published, witnesses came forward. Now, they reported seeing a man in an alley behind a nearby dorm, and he was on crutches with a leg cast. And he was struggling to carry a briefcase. Ted later said that he lured Hawkins to his car before knocking her unconscious with a crowbar, and then he handcuffed her and he drove to Issaquah, where he strangled her before spending the whole night with her body. I mean, it's very sick and twisted, not gonna lie, just is. Now, Ted said that the morning after he returned to the alley and located her earrings and one of her shoes. Now, at one point, Ted actually worked at the Department Emergency Services. Now, this was a state government agency that was actually involved in locating the missing women. So he kind of got quite a good job for him because he kind of knew what was going on. And he actually met and dated at his job Carol Boone, who will come into this a bit later on. She will become quite important in that. So on July the 14th, Ted abducted 2 women in broad daylight from a crowded beach, and 5 female witnesses described an attractive young man wearing a white tennis outfit with his left arm in a sling. Again, he's got this sling thing. He introduced himself as Ted, and he asked for help unloading a sailboat from his tan Volkswagen Beetle. Now, 4 of them refused and 1 did accompany him. When she saw that there was no sailboat, she just fled out. 3 additional witnesses saw him approach Janice Ott, who was 23, and she was actually a probation caseworker for King County Juvenile Court. And Ted actually used the same sailboat story on her, and witnesses witnessed her leave the beach with Ted. Now, 4 hours later, he was looking for someone else. So Denise Naslund, I think that's how you pronounce her name. I'm sorry if I butcher anyone's name in this. I'm not very good with names, so I do apologise. Was 19 years old, and she was studying to become a computer programmer. And she left a picnic to use the restroom, and she never returned. Now Ted says that Janice was alive when he returned with Denise, so he forced one of them to watch as he murdered the other, which is like some really sick and twisted game, I suppose, to him. So with enough information, finally, the King County Police posted flyers throughout Seattle, and also a composite sketch, I think that's how you pronounce it, I'm not very good at words, as we already know, was printed in newspapers and broadcasted on local TV stations. Now on September 6th, 2 goose hunters made a disturbing discovery as they stumbled across some skeleton remains. Now these were of Denise and Janice, and they were near a service road in Issaquah, I think that's how you say it. There was also an extra femur and several vertebrae, and they were identified by Ted as Gregorian. So in August 1974, Ted received a second acceptance letter from the University of Utah Law School, and he moved to Salt Lake City, and he left Elizabeth, who he was still dating, in Seattle, probably so that he could kill more and not have anyone to worry about, you know. So he often called Elizabeth, but however he dated at least half a dozen different women while he was out there. While he was studying his first year of law again, he was devastated to find that the other students had some sort of like intellectual capacity that he didn't. And that really devastated him. And the following month, a brand new string of murders occurred. And a lot of people think it was because, like, the fact that he realised that they had like some sort of intellectual capacity that he didn't, kind of triggered him a bit and made him start again. So on September the 2nd, Ted raped and strangled a still unidentified hitchhiker in Idaho, and on October the 2nd, he took and killed 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox in Holiday, and her remains were never found. And on the 18th of October, Melissa Smith, the daughter of the police chief in Midville, disappeared after leaving a pizza parlour. And unfortunately, so her new body was discovered nearby mountains 9 days later, and a postmortem indicated that she was alive for up to 7 days after she disappeared. Now on October the 31st, Laura Amy, 17, disappeared after leaving a cafe just after midnight, and again her naked body was found by hikers. But both Melissa and Laura had both been raped and sodomized and strangled with nylon stockings. Now, late afternoon of November the 8th, and Ted approached Carol Dronch, who was 18. He identified himself as Officer Roseland. So he identified himself as Officer Roseland of Murray Police Department. He told her that someone had tried to break into her car, and that she had to accompany him to the police station to file a complaint. Now, when she pointed out that he was driving along a road that didn't lead to the police station, he immediately pulled up and attempted to handcuff her. However, during the struggle he accidentally, in the struggle, put both handcuffs onto the same wrist, which was good because she was able to open the door and escape. However, later on that evening, 17-year-old Deborah Kent disappeared after leaving a theatre production at the school, as she was there to pick up her brother. Both a drama teacher and a student told police that someone had asked each of them to come out to the parking lot to identify a car, and outside the auditorium, police found the key that unlocked Carol's handcuffs. So in November, Elizabeth, so Ted's girlfriend, actually contacted police herself for the second time regarding the young women that were disappearing in the towns of Salt Lake City. So Detective Randy Hergeshner, I think that's how you say it, of Major Crimes Division, interviewed her in detail. By then Ted had risen on their suspect list, but some witnesses were unable to identify him in a photo lineup. So in January 1975, Ted returned to Seattle after his final exams, and he spent a week with Elizabeth, and she even made plans to visit him in Salt Lake City in August, but never told him about her contacting the police or anything like that. So on January the 12th, so a 23-year-old registered nurse, Karen Campbell, disappeared while walking from the elevator to her room at the Wildwood Inn in Snowmass Village. So her nude body was discovered 1 month later near a dirt road near the resort. She had been killed by blows to the head with a blunt instrument that had left distinctive grooved indents on her skull and sharp cuts to her body, deep sharp cuts from a very sharp weapon. So on March the 15th, a Vail ski instructor, Julie Cunningham, 26, disappeared, and Bundy later said he approached her on crutches and asked her to help him carry his ski boots to his car. And then he clubbed and handcuffed her. He then strangled and assaulted her at a secondary site. So then there was Denise Oliverson, who's 25, and she disappeared on April 6th while riding her bike to her parents' house. So her bike and sandals was found under a viaduct near a railroad bridge. On May the 6th, Ted led 12-year-old Lynette Culver, and he drowned her and sexually assaulted her in his hotel room before putting her body into a river. Now, Susan Curtis disappeared from campus at Brigham Young University on the 28th of June, and this was Ted's last confession that he made moments before he was executed. So on August the 16th, 1975, Ted was arrested by a Utah Patrol officer, Bob Hayward. Now, Hayward had seen Ted cruising a residential area at the pre-dawn hours, and Ted fled the area once he saw the patrol car, and he fled at high speed. So when they caught up with him, so they searched his car because they noticed that the front passenger seat had been taken out and put into the back. They found a ski mask, second mask made from a pantyhose, a crowbar, handcuffs, trash bags and a coil of rope and an ice pick. Now, Ted said that the ski mask was used for skiing. The handcuffs were found in a bin and the rest were just household items. However, Detective Jerry Thompson remembered a similar suspect and car description from Donna Roach's kidnapping. So after they searched Ted's apartment, police found a guide to Colorado ski resorts with a checkpoint by Wildwood Inn, a brochure advertising the Viewmont High School play, but they didn't have enough evidence to detain him. So Ted later said that they missed a collection of photos of his victims, which he immediately destroyed when he got out. So Salt Lake City police actually placed Ted under 24-hour surveillance. And Thompson and 2 detectives flew to Seattle to interview Elizabeth. And she told him that the year prior to Ted moving, she discovered objects that she couldn't understand in her house and Ted's apartment. Crutches, a bay of like plaster of Paris, a meat cleaver that was never used for cooking, and Ted was in debt, so she thought he'd just stolen the items to like sell them. And then when she confronted him about a new stereo, he got very annoyed and warned her that if she was ever to tell anyone, he would break her bleep neck. She also said that whenever she considered cutting her hair, which was long and parted in the middle, let's also remember that, he got very upset. So that September, Ted sold his car and Utah police impounded it and searched it. So they impounded it and the FBI technicians dismantled it and searched the whole car. And they found hairs matching samples obtained by Karen Campbell's body. So on October 2nd, the detectives put Ted into a lineup, and DeRonch immediately identified him as Officer Roseland. So he was charged with aggravating kidnapping and attempted criminal assault. So he was freed on a $15,000 bail by his parents, and he spent most of his time before his trial at Elizabeth's house, and police kept him under surveillance during this time. So in November, the 3 principal investigators met up in Aspen and exchanged information with 30 detectives and prosecutors over 5 states. That's how big the case was. Now in February of 1976, Ted stood trial for DeRonch's kidnapping. So after a 4-day bench trial and a weekend of deliberation, the judge found him guilty. And in June he was sentenced to 1 to 15 years in Utah State Prison. Now in October, Colorado police charged Ted with Karen Campbell's murder, and he was transferred to Aspen in January 1977. So in June, Ted had been transported for a preliminary hearing and had chosen to be his own counsel. So he was excused from wearing handcuffs and leg shackles by the judge. Now, during the recess, he asked to use the courthouse law library. I mean, why would no one think that would go wrong? So while he was shielding from the guard's view behind a bookcase, he opened up a window and he jumped. So he jumped and he injured his right ankle. So he removed his outer clothing and just walked through Aspen and just walked to Aspen Mountains. I mean, why not? Just escaped from your trial. Might as well just take a nice little walk into the mountains. So a few days later he stole a car and he ended up driving it back to Aspen because, you know, just escaped from there, why not drive back? And police noted that it was... So police noticed that the car was weaving like in and out, so decided to pull it over. So he'd actually been a fugitive for 6 days at this point. In 1977, Ted actually filed a motion to change venue from Aspen to Denver, and the judge granted this, but to Colorado Springs. So the night of December the 30th, you know, the guards and everyone are kind of on their Christmas break, and Ted decided to pile some books and files and covered them with a blanket in his bed. And he did this to simulate his sleeping body. So he crawled into this like crawl space and broke through the ceiling into the apartment of the chief jailer. He changed into street clothes from his wardrobe and walked out the front door. So after he stole this car, the car broke down. And it broke down in the mountains, so a passing motorist gave him a lift to the bus station and he caught the bus to Denver, and then he got a flight to Chicago. So 1 week after Ted had arrived in Tallahassee on January the 15th in 1978, Ted entered FSU's Chi Omega's sorority house. Now, this was about 2:45 in the morning. Ted, you know, he'd not been able to do anything for ages, so he had all these like things that were built up and he just let loose, unfortunately. So at 2:45 he bludgeoned Margaret Bowman, who was 21, and he bludgeoned her with a piece of oak wood, like firewood, as she slept, and then with an nylon stocking he strangled her to death. Now, he then entered 20-year-old Lisa Levy's room. So he beat her unconscious and strangled her and bit deeply into her left buttock, and he tore one of her nipples, and then he sexually assaulted her with a hair mist bottle. He then went on to attack Kathy Kleiner. So he broke her jaw and deeply cut her shoulder. He also attacked Karen Chandler, who suffered a concussion, a broken jaw, lost teeth, and a crushed finger. And both Kathy and Karen survived. And if that wasn't enough for him, once he left the sorority, he then broke into the apartment basement 8 blocks away of student Cheryl Thomas. He dislocated her shoulder and fractured her jaw and skull in 5 places. She was left with permanent deafness and equilibrium damage, which ended her dance career. So on the bed, police found a semen stain and pantyhose mask containing 2 hairs similar to Ted's in class and characteristic. So on February 8th, Ted drove to Jacksonville in a stolen van, and he approached 14-year-old Leslie Parmenter in a parking lot. She was the daughter of Jacksonville Police Department's chief of detectives, and Ted identified himself as Richard Burton of the fire department, but left when her older brother confronted him and challenged him. The following morning, at Lake City Junior High School, 12-year-old Kimberly Leach was summoned to her homeroom but never arrived. And 7 weeks later, after an intensive search, so her partially mummified remains were found in a pig farrowing. She appeared to have been raped, and her underwear was found near her body with semen in, and she was killed by violence to the neck with a knife. Now, February 15th, around 1 p.m, Ted was stopped by a police officer after a once on warrants check showed his car had been stolen. So when Ted was told he was under arrest, he kicked the officer's legs out from under him and took off running. Now the officer still arrested him, and in Ted's car was 3 sets of IDs belonging to female FSU victim, 21 stolen credit cards and stolen TV sets. And while the officer was transporting Ted to jail, he heard him in the back, as he didn't know he just arrested the FBI's most wanted fugitive, one of them. He heard him say Ted say in the back that he wished the officer had killed him. At trial, a crucial testimony came from a witness who said she saw Ted leaving the sorority clutching the murder weapon. They also had incriminating physical evidence, which included an impression of the bite wound on Lisa's buttock, and that was matched to castings of Ted's own teeth. The jury deliberated for less than 7 hours and came back and convicted him on July the 24th, 1979. And that was of Bowman's and Livy's murders and 3 counts of attempted first-degree murder and 2 counts of burglary. So the judge imposed death sentences for the murders. So 6 months later in Orlando, a second trial took place for the abduction and murder of Kimberly Leach, and Ted was found guilty. Now, during the penalty phase of the trial, Ted took advantage of really messed up Florida law that says in the presence of a judge, a marriage declaration in court, constitutes as a legal marriage. So when he questioned his former co-worker, Carol Boone, who he also dated for a while, as she was testifying on his behalf, he asked her, will you marry me? And she said yes. He then declared to the court that they were married, legally. So on February the 10th, 1980, Ted was sentenced for a 3rd time to death by electrocution. So 1981, in October, Carol gave birth to a daughter, and Ted is named on the birth certificate as her father. So later on, Ted initiated a series of interviews with Stephen Mahord and Hugh Answorth, and for the first time he began to discuss in detail what he had done in his crimes. He also talked about his career as a thief, and he said the big payoff for him was actually possessing what he had stolen. And possession proved to be an important motive for the rapes and murders. And he said that sexual assault fulfilled his need to completely possess his victims. So in early 1986, an execution date of March the 4th was set for the Sorority murders. However, a brief stay was issued, but in April a new date of July the 2nd was announced. And Ted finally confessed to detectives all his crimes and what he did to the victims. So Carol had championed Ted's innocence this whole time, and she felt like really betrayed by him confessing and found out that he actually did commit these awful crimes. So she took her daughter and moved back to Washington and refused to take any calls from Ted. Even on the morning of his execution, she still refused. So Ted died in a Rutherford electric chair at 16 minutes past 7 in the morning on the 24th of January 1989. And as his execution was being held out, hundreds of people sang and danced and set fireworks off in like a pasture across from the prison as it was all happening. Okay, so that is all on Ted Bundy. Hopefully in the next few weeks I will have another video up for you guys of this sort of thing. But yeah, I hope you all really liked this video, and if you like this makeup look, I can just do whatever, to be honest. But yeah, hope you all enjoyed, and yeah, I will see you guys in the next one. Bye guys.